"You're getting confused again, Mom." He said it so softly, almost kindly, as he took the pen from my trembling hand. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain. A doctor in a white coat sat by the window, nodding politely, while my son filled out the forms I was meant to sign. My name, written in someone else's handwriting, looked foreign on the paper. I remember staring at it, trying to place where the loops of the M had changed. For a second, I almost believed him. Maybe I was forgetting things. Maybe my head really had started to wander. Like he said, after all, I had misplaced the sugar tin that morning and left the kettle on too long. But when the doctor left the room and my son tucked the papers into his briefcase, smiling that practiced smile of concern, I caught a glimpse of the letterhead, "My late husband's lawyer." I knew then it wasn't confusion that was setting in. It was clarity, the kind that comes too late for most people, and right on time for the ones they underestimate. Mornings used to be my favorite part of the day. The house woke slowly, creaking in places where my husband once walked, sighing in the corners like an old friend stretching awake. I'd make tea the same way I always had, 1 spoon of loose leaves, a touch of honey, and milk warmed on the stove instead of the microwave. The cup I used was chipped on the handle. My son had told me to throw it away years ago, but I never did. Things that have survived years of use deserve to stay. The curtains by the kitchen window were thin, enough to let in the soft Lahore sun. Dust shimmered in the light, gentle and golden. Outside, the neighborhood kids shouted on their way to school. I used to wave to them, pretending they were my own grandchildren, though I rarely saw mine anymore. Their mother said they were busy, but I knew what that really meant. They'd outgrown me. I'd sit at the dining table with my tea and the morning paper. Sometimes I wouldn't read at all. I'd just trace the outlines of the headlines with my finger, listening to the clock tick behind me. That sound, steady, indifferent, became my company. My son Daniel called every evening. "Ma, did you take your pills?" "Yes, dear, don't forget the blue one before dinner." He said it every day, as though repeating it made it true. I sometimes wondered if he rehearsed concern. He used to visit on Sundays. We'd sit in the garden where his father planted marigolds. He'd bring his laptop, and while I talked about his father or the old days, he'd nod absently, his fingers tapping keys. I didn't mind at first. Children have their own worlds to manage. I was just glad to have him near. One Sunday, though, I noticed how he'd started checking his watch once, twice, then every few minutes. I was telling him about the summer his father built our wooden gate by hand, and he interrupted to ask if I had my house papers somewhere safe. "Of course," I said, surprised. "In the drawer, with the family documents." He smiled, to icily. "Good, just making sure." After he left, I went to the drawer and looked at the stack of papers, yellowed, wrapped in a string my husband had tied himself. I didn't untie it. Somehow, the knot felt sacred. Evenings were quiet. I'd cook a small meal, lentil soup or rice with pickled mango, and eat it in front of the old television. Sometimes the power would flicker out, and I'd light a candle, listening to the rain tap against the windows. That's when I felt closest to my husband. The silence between thunder rolls always felt like him waiting to speak. On one of those quiet nights, Daniel called again. "Ma, the doctor says you missed your appointment." I frowned. "What appointment?" "The one I scheduled last week." He sighed. "You forgot again, didn't you?" His tone carried no cruelty, just a weariness that made me want to apologize. So I did. I told him I'd be more careful. After we hung up, I checked the little notepad where I write everything down: groceries, calls, reminders. There was no mention of an appointment. Still, I told myself it was my mistake. I'm old. Old people forget things. That night, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights blink on, one by one. I remembered when Daniel was a boy, how he'd run barefoot across this same porch, clutching his toy car. He used to look back every few steps, making sure I was watching. He doesn't look back anymore. I touched the glass. My reflection faint in the dark, lined, tired, but still mine. I whispered a promise to myself. Don't let them decide who you are before you forget. The next morning came like all the others, the sound of sparrows, the hiss of the kettle, the smell of early sun and dust. I watered the marigolds. I folded Daniel's childhood blanket that still hung over the armchair. I thought about calling him, but didn't. Some silences, I've learned, say more than words ever could. It started with small things, small enough to make me question myself. Daniel began speaking to me in that tone people use with children, soft, slow, measured, like every word had to be placed carefully into my ears before it shattered. "Mom, he said one afternoon, as he stacked my bills into a neat pile. You really shouldn't handle this stuff anymore. It's just confusing for you. I looked at him over my glasses. Confusing for me. I've been paying bills since before you could spell electricity. He laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of indulgence that stung more than anger ever could. I know, he said, patting my hand, but you've got to admit, it's easy to mix things up now. Mix things up, that phrase lingered long after he left. A few days later, I discovered that my checkbook was missing from its drawer. When I asked him about it, he said I must have misplaced it, that he'd look around. He never brought it back. I started writing notes to myself on scraps of paper, reminders to take medicine, to call the bank, to lock the back door. But then, one morning, I found all my notes gathered neatly in a bowl on the kitchen table, as if someone had collected my memory and set it out for display. There was a sticky note on top, written in Daniel's handwriting. See, you're forgetting again. I stared at that note for a long time. My chest felt hollow, but I said nothing. I tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan. Evidence, though I didn't yet know for what. He began visiting more often after that, with a forced brightness that didn't suit him. He'd arrive with groceries I hadn't asked for, rearrange the furniture, and check my medicine cabinet, just keeping things safe. Mom, he'd say. Safe for who? I wondered. The house began to feel foreign in small, quiet ways. My teacups were stacked differently. My husband's photo, the one by the radio, had been moved from the shelf to the side table. The marigolds out front wilted from overwatering. Once, I walked into the kitchen to find him speaking softly on the phone. When I asked who it was, he said, just work stuff. But I caught one word before he hung up: evaluation. That night, I lay awake, replaying every small act of kindness that suddenly felt strategic. Every time he'd told me to rest, to stop worrying, to trust him. Every time I'd smiled and believed him. Maybe this was love, I told myself. Love disguised as concern. Or maybe concern disguised as control. The next morning, he arrived early, carrying breakfast from the cafe down the street. He was cheerful, almost too much. I made an appointment with Dr. Reynolds, he said, pouring me tea, just to check your memory. Routine stuff. I looked at him carefully. You think I'm sick? He paused, eyes softening in that same calculated pity. No, Mom. I just think it's better to know. He smiled again, the kind of smile that ends conversations. When he left that day, I walked to my desk and opened my husband's old notebook, the one he used for insurance, for bank contacts, for our lawyer. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and dust. On the inside cover, in my husband's handwriting, were 3 words: trust your mind. I traced the ink with my fingertip until the letters blurred. Something in me shifted, then quiet, but sure. Asterisk, the crack had formed, and once a crack appears in glass, it never stops spreading. The day it broke wasn't stormy or dramatic. It was ordinary. Sunlight spilling through the curtains, the smell of eggs and butter filling the air. Ordinary enough that I didn't see the betrayal coming. Daniel arrived just before noon, wearing his usual blue shirt and the faint smell of cologne. He greeted me with a kiss on the forehead, then went straight to the kitchen as if the house were already his. Dr. Reynolds will be stopping by today, he said, setting his briefcase on the counter. I froze, stopping by. You mean here? Yeah, he said casually. No need to stress about going to the clinic. I told him, it's better for you to be evaluated at home. Evaluated. The word landed like a stone in my stomach. I watched him open drawers, looking for the good cups, the ones I used when guests came. He didn't ask where they were, he already knew. That small detail hurt more than I expected. The doctor arrived a few minutes later, polite, professional, carrying a folder and a kind smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I sat in my armchair by the window. Daniel stood behind him, arms folded, as though he were my guardian. Mrs. Lawson, the doctor began, your son mentioned some recent forgetfulness. Just a few quick questions, if that's all right. I nodded, my throat dry. He asked me what year it was. I told him. He asked who the president was. I told him that. Then he asked me to name 3 objects on the table. Teacup, I said softly, spoon, and betrayal. The doctor blinked. Daniel's face tightened. She means butter, he said quickly. Mom's confused sometimes. I smiled faintly. No, dear, I meant betrayal. The room grew still. The doctor cleared his throat and made a note. Daniel gave a small, apologetic laugh. You see what I mean. After the doctor left, Daniel lingered, pacing near the window. "Mom," he said finally, "you embarrassed me today." "Embarrassed you?" I repeated, for answering questions truthfully. He turned toward me, and for the first time, his tone cracked. Not loud, but sharp. "You don't understand what's happening. You need help. I'm trying to take care of you, but you keep fighting me. By calling a doctor to my home, by taking my papers." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't even know what you're saying. Look at yourself. You forget things. You lose track of days. You left the stove on last week." "I turned it off," I said. "You turned it back on." That silenced him. His eyes flickered just a second, but enough for me to see it. The guilt he tried to bury. He lowered his voice again, softer now. "You're not well, Mum, and once the papers are finalized, I'll handle everything. The house, the accounts, your care. You'll finally rest." The papers. There it was spoken aloud. My chest tightened. Not from fear, but from the quiet ache of recognition. The boy I'd raised, the one who once clung to my dress in crowded markets, who cried when his father left for work, was gone. In his place stood a man who smiled while stealing my life piece by piece. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady, "do you remember what your father used to tell you when you lied?" He frowned. "What does that, a lie?" I said softly. "Is just a truth in hiding. But the truth always finds a way to come home." He stared at me for a long moment. Then, with a practiced smile, he picked up his briefcase. "Rest, Mom. I'll come by tomorrow. Maybe we can talk about moving you somewhere safer." When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. I sat in silence for a long time, the tick of the clock echoing through the empty rooms. I thought of my husband's steady hands, the way he'd fix broken hinges and say, "A thing worth keeping must be handled gently." Daniel had forgotten that, but I hadn't. That evening, as the sky turned a soft blue-gray, I went to my writing desk. I opened my husband's old box and took out a small black recorder, the kind he'd used to dictate letters. It still worked. I pressed record and spoke quietly into the microphone. "My name is Margaret Lawson. My son is trying to make me forget who I am, but I remember everything." My voice trembled at first, then grew steadier. "This house is mine. This life is mine, and I will not be erased." I set the recorder beside the lamp and watched its red light blink like a heartbeat. The betrayal was no longer a secret. It was evidence. There's a certain kind of quiet that only comes from remembering, not the kind that fills a room, the kind that fills a heart. That night, after Daniel left, I sat beside the recorder, staring at the small red light blinking in the dark. It reminded me of the lamp on my husband's nightstand, always left on until I fell asleep. The rain had started again, soft and patient. I closed my eyes and let the sound pull me backward, back to when the house was louder, warmer, alive. The kitchen was once the heart of this home. I can still hear the clatter of dishes, the whistle of the kettle, and the smell of fried onions and fresh bread. My husband, Thomas, used to hum while he cooked, always off-key, always smiling. Daniel would sit on the counter, swinging his legs, stealing pieces of raw dough when he thought I wasn't looking. "Daniel," I'd say, pretending to scold him, "you'll ruin your dinner." He'd laugh, flour on his cheeks, and Thomas would wink. "Let the boy be, Margaret. He's got his mother's appetite." We didn't have much money then, but it never felt like we were lacking. There was always laughter. There was always a purpose. I remember the first time Thomas brought home the marigold seeds. "They're simple flowers," he said, "but stubborn. They bloom, even when you forget to water them." He planted them just outside our window. Every summer, the air smelled of sun and soil and hope. When Daniel was 10, he brought home a school project, a drawing of our house. He had written in big crooked letters, "Home is where Mom remembers everything." I kept that drawing pinned above my desk for decades. It yellowed with time, but I never took it down. Years passed. Life happened in quiet increments. Birthdays, graduations. The day he left for college, Thomas cried that day. I didn't. I told myself mothers aren't allowed to cry when their children go chasing the world. After Thomas passed away, the house grew still. I'd wake in the night and reach across the bed for him, touching only cool sheets. The first morning after the funeral, I found a note he had tucked inside his coat pocket, one he'd meant for me. "Keep the garden alive," it said, "and trust your own mind, always." I folded that note and kept it in my prayer book. It felt like a promise, one I meant to keep. Daniel came home less often after that. I told myself he was busy, that work and family took time, but the distance between our conversations grew wider. until it wasn't distance anymore. It was a wall made of politeness. Still, when he did visit, I cooked his favorite dishes, chicken stew with rosemary, the way Thomas made it. I ironed his shirts before he arrived, even though he'd never notice. Love, I've learned, doesn't retire when it's unreturned. I remember one evening, years ago, when the power went out during dinner, we lit candles and sat in the dark, our faces glowing gold. Daniel was 16, moody and restless. He complained about school, about wanting more, about how small this town was. Thomas listened quietly, then said, "Son, don't ever make small the things that hold you up." Daniel rolled his eyes and said, "You sound like a preacher." Thomas just smiled. "Preachers talk about heaven. I'm talking about home." I didn't know then how much I'd cling to that moment. The last time we were all together before life began breaking apart in ways I couldn't see. When Daniel married, I cried at the wedding, not from joy or sadness, but something between them. His wife, Claire, was elegant, careful, and kind in the way people are when they're measuring you. She kissed my cheek, told me I was adorable. I gave them the house deed to make a copy for insurance purposes. A small thing, I thought. Trust is a mother's reflex. I didn't see that deed again for months. When I finally asked for it back, Daniel said it was somewhere safe. That phrase would follow me like a shadow for years. The memory dissolved when thunder rolled outside. I opened my eyes to the present, to the darkened room, the single lamp humming, the recorder's red light still steady. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, softer, too. The marigolds outside were gone now, the soil bare, the garden tired. I whispered to the night, "He's still my son." It came out as both prayer and confession. Because the truth is, I didn't hate him. I-COULDN single quotes T.Hate requires fire, and I'd burned through mine long ago. What remained was something quieter. The ache of disappointment. The grief of watching love turn practical. Still, beneath it all, something else stirred. Not rage, not fear, clarity. Thomas's voice echoed faintly in memory. "Trust your mind, Margaret." And for the first time in a long while, I realized I still did. I reached for the recorder again, pressed play, and listened to my own voice fill the room. It sounded steady, clear, alive. That night, before sleep, I opened my prayer book and placed Thomas's note beside a new one I wrote myself. It read, "You took my memory for weakness, but I remember everything, especially how to end a lie." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it between the pages. Then I turned off the lamp. The house, once again, exhaled, and somewhere, in that silence, I could almost feel Thomas smiling. Morning light came through the lace curtains, soft and forgiving, the kind of light that makes even broken things look gentle. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea gone cold, staring at the list Daniel had made for me, bold letters, blue ink, every line a reminder of what he thought I couldn't handle. "Take pills, don't leave the stove on, call me before you sign anything." The last line stayed with me. It wasn't advice, it was an instruction. Somewhere between care and control, he had crossed a line, and I had let him. For months, I'd excused every small cruelty as love, every patronizing smile, every confiscated document, every "you forgot" spoken with pity. I'd wrapped them in forgiveness like old linens folded and stored in a cedar chest. But now, as the clock ticked loudly in the quiet kitchen, I realized I wasn't the one losing memory. He was. He'd forgotten the woman who raised him, the woman who worked double shifts so he could go to college, the woman who knew every number in their checkbook by heart, who could fix a leaky faucet, balance a budget, and keep a promise without writing it down. He'd forgotten me, the me beyond his version of mom. It wasn't about my age, or my mind, or the slow shuffle of my steps these days. It was about control. He wanted to write the ending to my story before I could finish it myself, and for a while, I had almost let him. I looked around my kitchen, the same walls that once echoed with laughter and love, and felt something inside me harden. Not with anger, but resolve. I realized that my silence all this time had been mistaken for surrender. But silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's a strategy. That afternoon, I sat at my husband's old desk and opened the notebook again. The pages smelled faintly of age and trust. I wrote down everything, dates, conversations, details that would have seemed meaningless to anyone else, but to me, they were breadcrumbs, proof that I hadn't lost my way. When I finished, I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the cover. My pulse felt steady, my breath is calm. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of forgetting. I was afraid of being misunderstood. I stood and looked out the window. The garden was bare, but I could see where the marigolds had once been. Their roots still lay beneath the soil, waiting for spring. Maybe that's what I was now. Something dormant, not gone. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I sat in the dark with the recorder in my lap and spoke to it as if it were an old friend. My name is Margaret Lawson, I said again, softly. I remember my life. I remember my husband's hands. I remember the truth of who I am. And I remember my son, the boy who used to bring me flowers from the yard and tell me I was the smartest person in the world. My throat tightened, but I kept speaking. If he's forgotten, then I'll help him remember, but not the way he expects. I pressed stop. The red light vanished, leaving me in silence, a silence I finally owned. The next morning arrived with the kind of stillness that feels like a choice. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the world washed and shining. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and jasmine from the garden. I sat at my husband's desk, the same desk where he used to sign contracts and write letters in neat cursive that slanted slightly to the right. The chair creaked beneath me, familiar and forgiving. I placed a fresh page in front of me and began to write, not to Daniel, but to Mr. Harold Gray, our family's lawyer, and one of the few men my husband ever fully trusted. I told him everything: the doctor's visit, the missing documents, the forged signature, the subtle, practiced manipulation that came dressed as concern. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. Truth, when told plainly, carries its own thunder. At the end of the letter, I wrote, Harold, if you still believe in the honesty of Thomas Lawson's wife, I ask that you come to my home, not as a lawyer, but as an old friend. Please bring a witness. I have something I need you to hear. I sealed the envelope and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. My fingers trembled slightly, but it wasn't weakness. It was adrenaline, the kind that comes from finally doing something. Later that day, I walked to the post office, slow, careful steps on the uneven sidewalk. The clerk smiled and offered to help, but I insisted on writing the address myself. There was power in that small act. Every letter, every curve of ink, felt like reclaiming a piece of my name. When I returned home, the phone rang. Daniel's voice filled the line, cheerful and tight. Mom, did you take your morning pills? Yes, I said, and the doctor called. He wants to schedule another evaluation. I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. That's fine, dear. Tell him I'll be ready. He paused. Suspicion flickered in his silence. You sound different today. Maybe I am, I said softly. Maybe I'm remembering things again. He laughed, uncertain. Don't start confusing yourself, Mom. Oh, I won't, I said, but I imagined someone might. I hung up before he could respond. That evening, I set the recorder on the kitchen counter and replaced its old batteries. I tested it twice. The red light blinked, steady and alive. Then, I went about my routine, as usual. Tea, newspaper, prayer. Only this time, every movement felt deliberate. My stillness had purpose again. When Daniel arrived the next morning, I welcomed him with coffee and an easy smile. I asked about his work, about Claire, about the children. I even laughed at one of his practiced jokes. He relaxed, thinking the tide had turned back in his favor. That was the point. While he spoke, I noticed his briefcase, the same one he carried every visit, resting on the floor beside the sofa. I knew what was inside: papers, pens, the power of assumption. As he talked, I forgot to stir my tea, letting the spoon rest motionless. My eyes wandered around the room, unfocused, just enough to play the part. You seem distracted, Mom, he said. Do I asked absently. Yes, he said, his tone softening. You see what I mean. This is why I worry. He reached for the papers again. I didn't stop him. Not yet. That night, I added another page to my notebook, the record of our conversation, the small manipulations, the practiced pity in his voice. Then, I opened my prayer book and placed my husband's note inside it once more. Trust your mind, it said, and I did. Because trusting my mind didn't just mean remembering what had happened. It meant choosing what would happen next. I wasn't going to confront him in anger. I wasn't going to cry or plead or shout. That would make me exactly what he wanted me to be: unstable, emotional, fragile. No. I would let him prove himself wrong. I would let him confess in the very room where he thought I'd already forgotten. I turned off the lights and stood by the window. The moon reflected faintly in the glass. The garden looked ghostly in silver light. but I could see where the marigolds would grow again when the time was right. Quietly, I whispered, "It's time. Not for revenge, for remembrance." Harold Gray arrived 3 days later. He hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same upright posture, the same careful tone that made even hard truths sound gentle. He stood at my door in a gray overcoat, holding his leather briefcase. "Mrs. Lawson," he greeted, eyes kind. "You look well." "Appearances," I said softly, "can still be deceiving." He smiled faintly, understanding without asking. I led him into the sitting room, where I'd set the stage carefully, tea steaming on the table, the recorder hidden beneath the folded napkin, its red light concealed under lace. A few minutes later, Daniel arrived. His surprise at seeing Harold was brief, a flicker of confusion replaced by the smooth confidence of someone used to talking his way through life. "Mr. Gray." "What a surprise," he said, setting his briefcase down beside mine. "I didn't know you two were still in touch." "Oh, we never really lost touch," Harold said icily, settling into the armchair opposite him. "Your father and I built quite a long friendship. Your mother wrote me recently, said she had some questions about her affairs." Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Her affairs," he repeated, glancing at me. "Mom, you didn't need to bother him. I've been taking care of everything." "I know," I said gently. "That's exactly why I called him." Harold lifted an eyebrow. "If it's all right, Daniel, I'd like to review some documents with your mother. Alone, preferably." Daniel laughed, polite, disbelieving. "She gets overwhelmed easily, Mr. Gray. I've been helping her manage things. You understand how that is at this stage." "I do," Harold said, "but I'd still like to hear directly from Mrs. Lawson, for clarity." Something shifted in Daniel's face, a shadow of impatience, quickly buried. "Of course," he said, "but maybe I should stay, to help translate." That was when I let the silence stretch. Silence can be a powerful thing. It exposes the sound of someone's guilt trying to rearrange itself. Finally, I said softly, "Let him stay, Harold. He's been handling things for me. Let's hear what he's been doing." Harold nodded slowly, reading the subtext. For the next half hour, Daniel performed. He spoke of misplaced bills, missed appointments, and memory lapses that never happened. He produced papers from his briefcase, neat, organized, stamped. He used words like competency, medical consent, and power of attorney. Harold listened patiently, his hands folded. I kept my expression blank, the way old women do when the world stops listening to them. When Daniel finished, he looked proud, almost relieved. "You see, Mr. Gray, I've taken every precaution to make sure she's safe. I have medical documentation confirming her cognitive decline." "May I see it?" Harold asked. Daniel hesitated just long enough to betray himself, then handed over a folder. Harold opened it and scanned the pages quietly, his brow furrowed once, twice. "This signature here," Harold said, pointing, "looks inconsistent." Daniel shrugged. "Her hand shakes. You know how it is at her age." I leaned forward slightly. "Do I?" He froze. Harold set the papers down. "Mrs. Lawson, would you mind telling me, did you sign these documents?" I met Daniel's eyes. "I don't remember signing them," I said, drawing out the word just long enough. "But I do remember where my husband kept his fountain pen, and that's not his ink." A bead of sweat rolled down Daniel's temple. "Mom," I raised a hand gently. "No, dear, let me finish." The room felt smaller now, the air heavy. I turned slightly toward Harold. "I've been told I'm losing my memory," I said. So I began recording my conversations, for my own safety. Daniel's face went white. "Mom, what are you?" Harold lifted a finger. "Go on." I reached under the napkin and pressed play. The recorder's red light blinked to life. My voice filled the room, calm and steady. The conversation from last week, word for word. "You'll embarrass me. Mom, you're not well. Mom, once the papers are finalized, I'll handle everything." Asterisk, each word landed like a slow drumbeat. Daniel stood frozen, color draining from his face. I turned to Harold. "You see, Mr. Gray, I may forget where I left my glasses, but I never forget betrayal." When the recording ended, silence settled, thick as fog. Daniel tried to speak, but no words came. Harold stood, gathering the papers. "Mrs. Lawson," he said formally, "we'll need to meet privately tomorrow. There are some legal steps we can take to correct this situation." Then, turning to Daniel, his tone cooled. "And I'll be sending a copy of this recording to Dr. Reynolds, for his records." Daniel swallowed hard. You set me up." I smiled faintly. No, dear, you set yourself up. I just pressed record. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw fear behind his eyes. Not of me, but of the mirror I'd quietly held up. He left without another word. The door shut behind him, softer than I expected. When Harold was gone, I sat alone with my tea, the recorder still warm in my hand. Outside, the first marigold buds had broken through the soil. Small, defiant, alive. I whispered to them. He thought I'd forgotten. Then, after a pause, but some things, some people remember too much. He didn't come back for 3 days. The house felt strangely calm in his absence, as though even the floorboards had stopped bracing for his footsteps. I spent those days in silence, a silence not of loneliness, but recovery. I watered the marigolds. I washed the old teacups. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, just to keep my hands busy. On the 4th day, I heard the car, same tires crunching over gravel, same hurried slam of the door. I didn't move. I stayed seated in my armchair, the recorder and Harold's signed letter resting quietly beside me. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped in, not with his usual confidence, but a kind of cautious shame that barely fit him. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes tired. He looked smaller somehow. "Mom," he said, his voice low. I nodded toward the sofa. "Sit." He hesitated, then he did. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the slow tick of the clock and the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I waited, not to punish him, but to give him space to face himself. Finally, he said, "The doctor called me. He said he got a copy of the recording." I nodded. "Good. Then we can stop pretending I imagined things." He rubbed his forehead, eyes glassy. "You don't understand, Mom. I wasn't trying to hurt you. He paused, searching for words. "I just didn't want you to end up alone. I thought I could take care of things before you got worse." I studied him quietly, by taking away what's mine. He flinched, but didn't answer. I leaned forward, hands clasped. "Do you know how it feels, Daniel? To walk into your own home and feel like a guest. To be told you're confused when you're the only one seeing clearly?" His eyes filled. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Yes, you did," I said gently. "You meant every paper, every signature, every word you used to convince the world I was fading." He dropped his head into his hands. "I was scared," he whispered. "After Dad died, I didn't know how to handle anything. I didn't want to lose you. I let out a long breath. You didn't lose me, Daniel. You misplaced your trust. You started believing that control was the same as care." He looked up then, a boy again, not a man, and I saw the flicker of the child who once brought me flowers from the yard. His voice trembled. "I just wanted to protect you." "From what?" I asked softly. "From memory, from yourself." Tears slipped down his cheeks, quiet, ashamed. He reached for my hand. For a moment, I wanted to pull away, but I didn't. I let him hold it, just long enough to remember that forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. After a long silence, I said, "Harold's handling the legal matters. You'll have no control over my estate now. The power of attorney has been revoked." He nodded slowly, defeat heavy in his posture. I figured. I took a breath, then added, "But I'm not pressing charges, not this time." His head snapped up. "You're not?" "No," I said, "because punishment doesn't always teach. Sometimes silence does." He blinked, confused. "Silence?" "Yes." I released his hand. "I don't need to scream to be heard anymore. I've left enough proof of who I am. You'll have to live knowing you tried to erase your own mother and failed." He swallowed hard, unable to speak. I stood and walked to the window, opening the curtains. The light spilled across the room, the same soft, forgiving kind that used to fill our kitchen when he was a boy. "I used to think memory was something you lose," I said, still facing the garden. "But it's not. It's something you guard. You keep it alive in silence, in resilience, in the quiet moments no one notices." When I turned back, he was standing, his eyes red. "What do you want me to do now?" "Leave," I said gently. "Not forever, just long enough to remember who you were before you started believing I was your burden." He hesitated at the door. "Mom, I'm sorry." "I know," I whispered. "Now try to remember why." When he was gone, the house filled with peace, so complete it almost frightened me. The air was lighter, the shadows softer. I picked up the recorder and pressed play one last time, not to relive the hurt, but to remind myself that I had endured it. The sound of my own voice filled the room. "My name is Margaret Lawson. My son is trying to make me forget who I am, but I remember everything. I closed my eyes and listened until the recording ended. Then I whispered the last line again, under my breath, not for proof, but for peace. I remember everything. And this time, the house whispered back. The days that followed felt lighter, as though the air inside the house had shifted. No more rehearsed concern, no clipped tones over breakfast, no footsteps pacing through my silence, just the small sounds of an old home rediscovering peace, the clock ticking steadily, the window blinds rustling with the wind, and the soft rhythm of my own breath. I spent my mornings in the garden again. The soil was damp from last night's rain, and when I knelt to touch it, it gave easily beneath my fingers, warm, alive, forgiving. A marigold had bloomed, just one, bright gold in a sea of green. I smiled. "You stubborn little thing," I whispered inside. The house seemed to breathe differently now. I opened windows that had been closed for months. The curtains fluttered, letting in streaks of sunlight that danced across the floors. I moved more slowly these days, but not from weakness, from intention. I wanted to feel everything I had almost lost: the smell of soap, the warmth of tea, the sound of morning birds calling each other awake. I took out my husband's old recorder and rewound it to the very beginning. I listened to the first entry I had made, the tremor in my voice, the fear hiding between breaths. Then I pressed record again. "My name is Margaret Lawson," I said softly. "I am not losing my memory. I am reclaiming it." Silence followed, deep and pure, the kind that doesn't ask for noise to feel full. I thought about Daniel, about the boy who once hid behind me during thunderstorms, whose tiny hand used to curl around my finger. He wasn't evil. He was lost. Lost in fear, in greed, in the noise of wanting control over what he didn't understand. And maybe that's what growing old teaches you, that even those who wound you were once children who didn't know the weight of their own hands. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a door you open for them. It's a window you open for yourself to let light in again. I poured tea for two out of habit, placing the second cup across the table from me. The steam rose in delicate ribbons, and for a moment I imagined Thomas sitting there, the corners of his mouth curved in that knowing smile. "You were right," I whispered. "Trust your mind." The wind answered with a sigh through the curtains, soft and approving. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth move through me. The clock ticked on, steady, unbothered by the things it had witnessed. Sometimes silence isn't punishment, it's peace. And for the first time in years, peace was enough. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps, uncertain, almost apologetic. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, a small voice said, "Hi, Grandma." It was Lily, Daniel's youngest, 10 years old, hair braided, clutching a small box in both hands. She looked up at me with wide, careful eyes, the kind children wear when they're afraid they've inherited a secret. "Your dad brought you?" I asked softly. She shook her head. "No, Mom dropped me off. Daddy said he'll come later, if that's okay." I smiled gently and stepped aside. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in." She followed me into the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the floor. I poured her a glass of milk and slid over a plate of butter cookies. She nibbled one without speaking. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, just tender, like both of us were waiting for something we didn't quite know how to name. Finally, she opened the box she'd been holding. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. "Daddy told me to give this to you," she said. "He said you'd know what it means." I took it gently from her hands. The handwriting hit me before the words did. Daniel's, but shaky, uneven, not the confident scrawl he used on legal documents. It read, "Mom, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm trying to remember the right things again." I told Lily the truth about what I did. She asked me why grown-ups lie. I told her sometimes they forget the sound of love until it goes quiet. "You were right about silence. It taught me more than shame ever could. If you'll let me, I'd like to visit one day, not as your caretaker, but as your son, Daniel." My hands trembled slightly as I folded the letter back into the box. Lily was watching me carefully. "Is Daddy in trouble?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "No, my love. He's remembering." She tilted her head. "Remembering what?" "That love," I said softly, "isn't about control. It's about trust." Lily nodded thoughtfully, as if she understood more than I expected. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a marigold, a single, bright stem she'd plucked from the garden outside. "For you," she said. I took it, feeling its rough stem between my fingers. "You know," I whispered, Your grandfather planted these. He said they're stubborn flowers. They grow even when you forget to water them. Lily grinned. Then they're like you. The laugh that escaped me came from somewhere deep, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in years. I pulled her into a hug, her small arms wrapping around me with fierce warmth. For a moment, the years folded in on themselves. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It was full again, of memory, of forgiveness, of the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken to be known. When Lily left that evening, I watched her run down the path to her mother's car, the marigolds swaying gently in her wake. The light was fading, but the gold in the flowers caught the last rays of sun, glowing like something that refused to die. I went back inside and placed Daniel's letter on the table beside my prayer book. Then I tucked Lily's marigold into a glass of water. It leaned toward the window, chasing the light. Somewhere, in that moment, I realized memory doesn't belong to the past. It blooms where you tend it, in the hearts that come after you. And maybe that's what legacy truly is. Not the money, not the house, not the name, but the chance to be remembered rightly. I've learned that memory isn't a photograph, it's a pulse. It changes, fades, returns, it hurts, heals, and forgives. Some people try to steal it, thinking it's made of paper and ink, but memory doesn't live in documents or signatures. It lives in the quiet, in the scent of tea leaves, in the bloom of a marigold, in the trembling of a hand that still dares to write its own name. Daniel once told a doctor that I was confused. Maybe I was, but not in the way he thought. I was confused about how love turns into fear, how care turns into control, how silence can sound so much like surrender. Now I know better. Silence isn't the absence of power, it is power, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be remembered. If anyone ever tells you you're losing yourself, smile gently and let them speak, because the truth has a way of finding its way home, even through the fog. You come from a woman who remembered in silence, who let them write her off, and then wrote herself back in ink they'll never erase.